Thank you very much for asking me. You are a bigger audience, more people than I have seen in one place in 2 years. It's very exciting and a bit intimidating, I have to say. But anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here. And so many of the people I'm indebted to have been thanked by everyone who's gone before me, that I'm not going to repeat their names. I'm just going to add in one more, and that is an Oberlin undergraduate whose name is Lucy Williams, without whom this lecture would have been absolutely impossible. So thank you, Lucy. I hope you're here somewhere. I have used this archive so much since I began to work on Hesse. And I feel like this is like a second home for me in a way. I just love coming here. I love looking at everything, and to see it up on your walls is just an amazing thing, because usually I see it out of boxes that are brought out of the archive. So it's very, very exciting to see this. I saw the show in New York at Hauser and Wirth, and it looked fabulous, even though it was another selection. But nonetheless, to see it here is just heartbreaking. It's just gorgeous. So forgive me, but I am going to talk about my museum and this archive, and mostly about one work of art. And I've chosen to give the subtitle to my talk, Not Piece, Untitled, Wrote Piece. And what I'm going to talk to you about is what I call wrote piece. So forgive me for that. It's not officially its name, as I will explain. So to start at the beginning, and I'm going to ask, somebody is going to change the slides for me, which makes it easier for me. But if you could change the slide now to slide 2, that would be great. The next slide. Okay, great. So here's where I begin with wrote piece. In 1991, when I had just come to work at the Whitney from Boston, I became, not to be melodramatic, but totally enthralled by the life and work of Eva Hesse. Eva Hesse was in the collection of the Whitney. Before the experience of deciding to work on Eva Hesse, I had been, as a curator, primarily working with living artists, as you can see from the names of the exhibitions of most of the people I worked on. I was particularly known for, I guess, working with artists who worked on the cutting edge, who made things often too complicated for me to explain as art to the public, but that was my job. When I saw the work of Eva Hesse, I realized that I was working with an artist who was not a living artist, but who was presenting me with the same issues as living artists, work that I had to really come to terms with to understand. Hesse had died in 1970, 20 years before I started my work. In the years that have followed, I have become entangled with Hesse, and I use the word knowingly because this is a work about entanglement. This is the first work of Eva Hesse's that I came to know well. It is a work that's purposefully entangled by the artist herself. I realized that many of the works by the living artists that I had worked with had also been entangled in other ways. Wrote piece was difficult, it was uncertain, it was hard to explain as art. And because of those qualities about it, I have felt an uncompromised attraction to it since the first day I saw it, to its puzzles, and they still remain puzzles to me. So this is a work in progress. All of you know the facts of Eva's life. She was born in Germany in 1936. Now, just because I love to do this, I'm going to show you several photographs of Eva Hesse, working my way pretty much through time. So next slide, please. This is another slide. I just want to point out that this talk will go between wrote piece as you saw it in the museum, in the Whitney Museum, and wrote piece as it existed in Eva Hesse's studio when she died. And that's Eva Hesse's studio when she died. Next slide, please. So where does this begin? In this photo, Eva Hesse is 28. She's evanescently beautiful, as you can see. She's in Cologne at a Kunstverein museum, and she was having her first show of her reliefs, which were her first three-dimensional works. She leans into these reliefs, as you can tell, which are very near bodily expressions of her own physical presence. She holds them in her arms. Next photograph, please. The next photographs are taken when Eva has come back from her year in Germany, and they're taken at her studio at 134 The Bowery in Lower Manhattan, where she was to live for the rest of her life. This photograph was taken a year later, either 65 or 66. Next slide. Here we see the works that she made as soon as she came back from Germany, hanging in that studio. You see wall-hanging works, floor-based works, all of them slightly crazy and sexual. And as you saw before, we saw her making them herself. In the photo of her making them, instead of posing with them as extensions of her body, she's more a working artist, working on them. Next slide. This is a fourth photograph. This shows Hesse in the front row, you can see. After she's separated from her husband, Tom Doyle, who she had been in Germany with, she's kind of sexily leaning into her then boyfriend, Mike Todd, himself an artist, and they're shown with a group of people that she's not usually associated with. All these people are not the minimalists, but they happen to include one of the artists I'm particularly interested in, Paul Tech on the right, who became a friend of hers. And so I've always been interested in this photograph because it kind of kicks Eva Hesse out of the minimalist camp and shows her as part of some other crowd, and I think that's very interesting. The next photograph. Here's a photograph taken by somebody, I won't go into the photographer, but he was a fashion photographer. His name is Herman Lansehoff, and he was sent to Eva Hesse's studio in, I think about 66 or 67, and took a bunch of wonderful photographs of her sort of playing around with her sculpture. And here she is lying on a settee covered by kind of a quilt made of ropes. And the ropes obviously interest me a lot because these ropes become increasingly important to her and have always been. And then the last photograph is Eva Hesse at the end of her life. This is also taken in the attic of her Bowery apartment where she made rope piece, and she's seen here looking out of it. She died. This was taken in January. She died in May. So next slide. Here we see Eva Hesse with her sister. These are other photos, which I will show you a few of, that are rarely seen of Eva Hesse in the art books, but they are very important photographs that are preserved in the diaries or baby books, or as they're called in German, the Tagebücher, that Eva's father, William Hesse, kept a series devoted to her, a series devoted to her sister Helen. And these diaries, which I will show you a little bit more of later on, are scrapbooks of handwritten entries, as you can see here. This one was taken in 1937 when Eva was just over a year old, and these are pictures of sisters before they left Germany. And the books become extremely interesting on many levels, but they chronicle the history of these children, their family, what they lived through as they survived Nazi Germany and took up life in New York. My first foray into Hesse's work, as I said, was at the Whitney. I had been hired as a curator, and I had decided around 1966 that I would do an exhibition of Hesse's work. What the curatorial process of doing an exhibition, for speaking to lots of my colleagues in this room, and they all know this, what it entails is going to see all the work that you are going to put in the exhibition in the flesh, not looking at it in pictures of books. And this is particularly important when it comes to Eva Hesse. So I went around to all sorts of collections, public, private, in the US and Europe, looking. I had to persuade most of the lenders of the Eva Hesse work to lend to my exhibition. The work is fragile. And then to help, with the help of many, many people, and you've heard many of their names before, Helen Cherish, Barry Rosen, all the people at Hauser and Wirth, many, many people, we assembled the work into a comprehensive exhibition, which, as it turns out, did not come to the Whitney Museum, but was in San Francisco at the Museum of Modern Art there, and a large public catalog was published. This is no small task, the curatorial task. What ensued, and this is a true opportunity of being a curator, I should say, was a deep dive into the physical facts and the history of all the work. Every work of Eva Hesse's that I worked at had a story behind it, and it had to be looked at and thought about, and that's what doing this exhibition allowed me to do. I began, of course, with the work in my own museum, a piece that was made in 1970, technically known as Untitled because Eva never gave the title, but which has more familiarly and descriptively, I think, been called Rope Piece. I want to stop for a minute just to talk about being a curator a little bit, because it's a very unusual experience to have what I call a long confrontation with one work of art. And that's what being a curator in a museum such as mine, the Whitney, has allowed me to do with this work. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to look and look and look at any one piece. And I would argue that this one piece, Rope Piece, reveals so many deep, complicated resistances to ever telling you completely what it's all about. But I kept and I keep asking, what is its meaning? And how did this work come to be? How did this physical thing come to be? Here are some facts about Rope Piece. The work that I looked at was purposefully an entangled work, entangled by the artist, as I will describe. It was made in 1970 and was the next to last piece that Hesse made. She died of a brain tumor at the age of 36 in May 1970. She had begun to work on the piece in January before that May. The piece then, Rope Piece, was acquired by the collector Victor Gans in 1972 after Eva died, and then by the Whitney Museum from his estate in 1988. Sorry. I had known Rope Piece from books, pictures and books that I had read about Eva Hesse, but I had always seen it in books hanging on display. What I had never seen was the way Rope Piece looked when I saw it in 1996 in storage at the Whitney. That is firsthand in the museum's storage. Unfortunately, I still have not been able to find any photos of this piece in storage the way it looked when I first saw it. But I remember that the piece was not hanging in space, as you see it, but was lying horizontally like it was in bed, fixed in place in flat panels and covered with glassine paper. It was just a piece cared for in the museum's collection. It was like a drawer had been pulled out and there was Rope Piece inside of it. It wasn't the sculpture that I had seen hanging in space. It was just a tangle of ropes and wires lying like, it looked like merchandise in a hardware store, honestly. It was hard for me to imagine how this piece that was being showed to me, this commonplace thing in museum storage, had become this icon, which I had seen in books, and certainly the great work of art, which I now believe it to be. I had only seen Rope Piece in reproduction, hanging from the ceiling to which it was attached. In photographs up close, the work's ropes and wires looked like the dictionary definition of a tangle. Next slide, please. There you see it as it was installed recently. And next slide, please. This is the up close part. The work's ropes and wires look like the dictionary definition of tanglement, intertwined, confused, too dense to really understand at the distance of most photographs. I really must have looked at it and struggled to understand it, its materiality. How could something like this have been made? It was so non-directional, no axes, no borders, no boundaries. I'd never seen anything like it that was called a sculpture. And I wondered, how had its non-form become a form? Had she done it by plan or accident? If you go to see rope piece and you look at it closely like this, what do you see? The ropes themselves are actually different kinds of ropes. Some of them are thick, some of them are medium weight, and some of them are string-like. How did this tangle come to be? How did the makers of it, how did they take these ropes and wrap them, loop them, twist them, join them, toss them, one section over another, dip them into liquid rubber and hang them to dry from the ceiling? We know that this work, rope piece, has had an afterlife, and I will show you what it looked like when it left 134 the Bowery attic. The bare facts of its afterlife, where it's been hung ever since, is that it was always hung in space as it was in Eva's attic. Wires attached the work to the wall, and other wires at 11 or 13 points determined in its making by Eva attached the work to the ceiling. As I went further into the history of rope piece, I began to realize, though maybe this was my problem or my fantasy, not Eva's, that Hesse saw this piece as continuing to possess the memory and the mystery of its spontaneous making, and that she thought its display over time would be variable and changeable, and conditions would create the way it looked. I began to believe that this next to last work made by an artist who knew she was close to death really defied being finished. It defied closure, that it might continue to change and to have an active life. I felt that rope piece had a kind of magical feeling. More facts that have emerged from my investigation. Rope piece was actually made in 2 stages in early 1970 on the 2nd floor of this loft. Eva was very sick and she needed assistance. She couldn't make work by herself, but she was determined to go on working in spite of extremely limited physical strength. And for the first time, she really had to rely on assistance. Hesse's ideas for rope piece emerged from a few scraps of paper, and this is where the archive begins to come in, that are now actually still in private collections. Next slide. This is the first one, and I don't think it's any secret, this belongs to the collector Kate Gans. And you see an early idea for rope piece in this drawing, where you see it has one horizontal plane and then everything else drops down from it. Another drawing, the only other drawing that I know of that exists for it, next slide, is this one, which is in the collection of her friend Gioia Timpanelli. And this is kind of an unusual drawing for Eva. It's a typewritten drawing with typewritten notes for 2 very late sculptures, one of them rope piece. And it shows that, and I'll tell you more about what the instructions for rope piece, which is the bottom piece in this drawing. This is in the collection of Gioia Timpanelli, who I just want to bring into the story because she was very important at the end of Eva's life. She's known for her own work as a very important writer and storyteller, but at that point in her life, she was a friend and a close companion of Eva Hesse, and they had spent a remarkable summer together in Woodstock, New York. They made art in tandem every day. I think she's actually written about her summer with Eva Hesse, and it's a wonderful piece. You should read it. They lived in a small cabin and they made art every day. And Hesse was determined, this was after one brain operation, to work ardently and intentionally all summer. Her good health, reasonably good health, didn't last that long. And she died 9 months later. And as you've heard, what happened eventually was that a great deal was left in her studio, And her sister, Helen Cherish, who's here today, salvaged a great deal of so-called ephemera that was left in her studio. Any sculpture and drawings that were made in the prime of Hesse's short career, that is from the mid-60s to her death, were rescued by her dealer, Donald Droll, and taken back to Fishback Gallery. However, the trove of early work, extensive work notes, drawings, appointment books, journal entries, juvenilia, as someone said, and other ephemera were left in Hesse's studio. All her diaries, which she kept extensively, were found in a shopping bag. Many drawings that you see hanging in the galleries were in a huge steamer trunk. Most of what is now in the Eva Hesse Archive at the Allen Museum was salvaged from the studio at that time. The single sheet that Timpanelli owns, though, is very helpful in understanding what Hesse wanted from rote piece. She often sketched out an image and some descriptive text for work, and you can see it in some of the drawings here, because it's very interesting to look at these drawings for sculpture, because she's thinking all the time and she's writing notes to herself and drawing at the same time. You can see her thinking about it. But at this point, this sheet is different. The description is typed for one, and I wonder if Joya typed it. She was physically unable to make work herself. And so the notes at this point become instructions, not for herself, but for those who were helping her. And these two works were made in the last year of her life. They are work 5, or work 4 and work 5, and work 5, as I said below, is the robe piece. And this is what was typed and what said, you can't read it, so I'll read it to you. Work 5th, which is rope piece. Rope rubberized with filler, all sizes, widths, colors, connected to plastic. Connected to the plastic one I made, but reaching much closer to what I had envisioned for that piece, the way it had started before I got sick. Now, she's referring here, and you can go to the next slide, to this work, which, as you can see, looks a lot like rope piece, except it was made with fiberglass. It was made in the studio with somebody who was her assistant, really worked with her, whose name was Doug Johns. And it's entirely beautiful, and it's not what she wanted. This is what she had envisioned for the work, is what we got in our piece, rope piece. What she had not wanted from that piece is what you're looking at, that beautiful piece. I return to the typewritten instructions for the piece on the sheet of paper. Hesse writes or types for her assistants. Hung irregularly, tying knots as connection, really letting it go as it will, allowing it to determine more of the way it completes itself. Make it with at least 2 or 3 of us connecting from wires from the ceilings and nails from the walls and other ways. Let it determine more itself, how floppy or stiff it might be, what its colors are, how much rope. It must be rope piece, end of quote. Moving from the notes to the construction itself, this is what we know. Rope piece was made in 2 different parts. The first was made in January for the Life magazine shoot, which I'll return to in a minute. Life magazine had decided they wanted to do a story on the legacy of Jackson Pollock. They wanted to look at the artists who they thought were interpreting his groundbreaking drip paintings, and Hesse was one of those people. So a photographer was sent to her studio, and Hesse was photographed with rope piece. Several photographs remained from this shoot. One of them I showed you in the beginning, and then these other 2, next slide, please, are really wonderful little test Polaroids that were made by the photographers before they shot the formal photograph of Hesse. And one of them on the left is actually not Eva Hesse, it's Kate Gans, who was in the studio with the Life magazine photographer, and the one on the right is Eva Hesse, and they are posing with rope piece. The reason these are so extraordinary to me is because Eva Hesse never lived to see rope piece hanging in her anywhere else except at this moment in her studio. So we don't know what she meant for the work, as I will go into. This is as close as we're ever going to get. This was January. A second section was made in March of that year. This is now 1970. And at this point, she had a trusted assistant whose name was Bill Barrett. And he made a second part of Rope Peace with her. And Bill Barrett has written actually about his time with Hesse quite a lot. And so I'll quote from him about making the second piece. The process was simple and quick, he wrote. We dipped the ropes into a bucket of latex. We knotted them, tangled them, and hung them from wires attached to the ceiling. Hesse died in May. A retrospective of her work was held in the at the Guggenheim Museum 2 years later. And before the archive found in the studio by Helen and other people came to Oberlin, came here, it was used by the writer Lucy Lepard, who was commissioned by Helen Cherish to write a book, a biography about Eva. Next slide, please. This is the famous biography that has really been the text about Eva Hesse's life. Lepard was a close friend of Eva Hesse's, and by the 1970s, when she was commissioned to write this book, she was already an important critic. But most important for me was how enmeshed she was in Hesse's world. And that's what lends this book its really astonishing immediacy. Her remarkable firsthand experience comes through in her description of Laocoon, which, as you know, is right here. Next slide, please. And here are photographs from Lepard's book, but you can actually see a couple of these drawings hanging in the walls in these exhibitions. Lucy Lepard writes, and she's writing this in the early 70s. So she's writing, the book came out in 76, but she's writing it for many, many years before it actually gets published. And so she's writing it right after Hesse died, and she can talk to anybody that she wants to. So this is what she writes about Laocoon, March 1966. And then this is Lucy now writing. A second title appears below this one in Hesse. Snakes. Later, Hesse mercifully replaced that title, Lepard says. Lepard goes on, Ray Donarski helped her build the plastic pipe armature, which in her small studio reached from floor to ceiling. Hesse worked on this, her first major freestanding sculpture, for a long time and discussed it with all her friends. I remember having strong reservations about the first version. There were then fewer coils, and no matter how they were arranged, they looked forcefully composed. The irrational element was not powerful enough to conquer or balance the rational structure, and something was wrong with the proportion, the thinesses and the thicknesses. That's Lucy's description of Laocoon. And Laocoon is clearly an extraordinarily important sculpture and very much related to the rope piece sculpture that's at the Whitney now. So what does Lepard actually say about rope piece in the biography written very closely to the time Eva died and from the perspective of talking to everybody in her studio? Lepard says the work has no title. She calls it untitled. And the photo sequence in the book starts with its hanging after Eva's death in Donald Droll's loft, and opposite the drawing that I showed you from Kate Gans. And then, next slide, please. This is the layout of that Lepard puts into her book just after her description of rope piece. And these are all photographs that were taken in Hesse's studio and rope piece, you can't make it out, I don't think, but it's in the top left photograph, and it's just pushed off to the side as she was continuing to work on one other sculpture that she completed more or less before she died. Lepard calls the work ugly, a counterpart to the fiberglass ceiling work that I showed you. Her firsthand knowledge of what went on in the studio in the making of Rope Piece is apparent from her quotes from her interview with David Magasis, who was Hesse's first helper. Lepard writes, "It was made by Hesse directing David Magasis, a friend who had nothing to do with art. Lepard quotes Magasis, this is Magasis talking now, "It was something she had in mind. Life magazine was coming to photograph in a couple of days. I went to my uncle's place and got cable cord in all sizes. I came back and she said, 'Do something.' What? Whatever you feel like doing. Do you want to make a knot? Yes. So make a knot." He dunked it in liquid rubber and strung it up. Magasis said she really had self-confidence all the time. After Rope Piece, Lepard wrote that she felt Hesse hoped to go, according to her notes, into pieces described as non-forms, non-shapes, not plan. Lepard concludes about Rope Piece. The piece has been called unfinished. Its installation is half the work and must be done by someone extremely familiar with Hesse's ideas. Most significantly, Lepard writes, "Its unfinished quality may have been what Hesse wanted," and this I believe. And her critical summation, I believe, of the piece's most remarkable qualities is right on mark. She says, the gestural intensity of Pollock's most passionately disturbed surfaces is in Rope Piece. And here, I think, is Lepard's great intuition about Rope Piece. Its sculptural suspension in midair, its central weight, she says, deepens the sense of risk. With the biography, Sala Witt was brought in, actually was, I think, there from the beginning, but his role was to design the book. And he did, with the help of Pat Steer, very interesting, this kind of scrapbook, black and white quality. The book is like a scrapbook, the biography. It is layered, it is fragmented, it's dense with history. It's like an archive itself. In both design and text, the book ricochets between a narrative of the life, the descriptions of making the work, like David Magasis, the context of the small downtown art world. Different typefaces are used as the text switches from being a description of major sculpture and drawings to the story of an artist. Studies of the sculpture abound near pictures of the finished work. So Lepard made total use of the archive of this ephemera that had been found in the studio. I think significantly for the book, and I believe this was always true of it, there's no color. It doesn't feel like a commercial undertaking. I have read all the texts of this book, the footnotes, the text. I've looked at all the illustrations. It's almost like a diary, firsthand account of Hesse's work. It's a written and a visual report on process of an artist who's thinking rather than just being a record of her finished work like most museum catalogs are. But of course, Lepard's narrative, as attentive as it is to Hesse's life as an artist, nevertheless, I feel, doesn't spend much time at all in anything that I believe is central to thinking about Hesse, and that is her past. Her past, who she is, who the Hesses were, and what they experienced is recounted in only a few pages in the narrative. She does tell us that Eva Hesse was obsessed with autobiography or with the past. She quotes two of Eva's friends. Her emotional source, one recalled, was not of the present. Another remembered never going to Hesse's house without a momentum for the past being brought out. She fed off that material. Its physical presence might have filled some of the voids in her life. For the past, we must look a little more closely now at William Hesse's archives, his Tagebuch, as preserved really the archive is preserved in the Tagebuchs. Within the covers of his scrapbooks and his daughter's books or diaries are the fragments of the history of his family and his time. His books provided portals into the past. They are the fragments of a lost life. It is if within the relatively harmless covers of record of a child, such as that one page I've shown you so far of the two sisters, which looks very, very sweet, like a children's a diary of bringing up your children. But really, these Taga books are much more than that, because in them, as they progress, he was able to write of the daily horrors that were unfolding around him. And it was as if these Taga books might escape, that they might escape seizure, and they might be the only survivals as refugees of family history. Hypothetically, this poignant collage-like text imprinted that this material of these books imprinted itself on the young Hesse. These books that still survive, and they are now in another archive in New York City, and they are incomparable as documents of family life in this period, even without their association with the life of the young artist Eva Hesse. I can't convey the full text that is written because it unfolds over many books. But here are a few examples, which I'll try to show you in chronological order. Next slide, please. So the first one of the two sisters was in Germany in 1937. Here, we've moved ahead a little bit, and the family is now on their way to the United States. This is a page from Eva Hesse's Tagebuch 2 from June 16th, 1939. And we see a photo of the family on the deck of the SS Manhattan. The text, which before had been written in German, is now in English. And a postcard is pasted on an adjacent page at the top of the World's Fair of 1939, which was at Flushing Meadows in Queens. And the family is going to live nearby in Manhattan. The fair on the postcard promises to be the world of tomorrow. And Hesse's father writes, "Will it be a better world?" The family seems to have hope. Next slide, please. This is another example of the Tagebuch from a little layer. This is from Helen Hesse's Tagebuch from June 1940, made at the time of the Nazi invasion of Germany. And cut and pasted headlines. You can see these are, I should point out that this is all handmade by William Hesse, and the photographs, many of the photographs are taken and developed by him as well. This kind of looks like a Weimar era collage a little bit. But next to this terrible headline is a picture of the family newly resettled in a park. And the father writes, 15 months ago, Helen and Eva were still in Holland, a narrow escape. In a poignant account of her father's death, which survives in Eva Hesse's own journals, which are here, she writes, Eva Hesse writes, of the Tagebuchs. She seems completely clear that her father's version of her life in the Tagebuchs was a record of his history as much as it was of hers. It is true, she writes, my books are also like your books were. Yours were for me, to me, about me, but you wrote them. They therefore were you, and they are about you. I think Hesse distances herself from the past, and she says about these Tagebuchs, it's her father's past. But the power of that particular history was absorbed by Eva Hesse, by affect and by osmosis. She did not feel the events in an ordered way of the destruction of her home because she was a little tiny girl. But what happened there were definitely events that were the substructure of her subsequent life. Her grandparents were lost, and her mother, who was brutally depressed by their loss, died by her own hand when Hesse was 9. Hesse, however, found her distance. What might have been negative and determined pessimism in her art did not materialize. In fact, she went back to Germany with Tom Doyle, as you could see from the first beginning of this talk. And after visiting the very places that her parents' birth, she came forth with a series of absolutely remarkable, game-changing drawings, some of which are here and reliefs that were absolutely exuberant, idiosyncratic to her, and very playful. And it was in Germany that she discovered her own artistic strength. So there's no easy answer to this situation of a family history, but nonetheless, there was a sense of destruction that she must have always carried. Next slide. And this kind of picture from, I think, one of the scrapbooks of Eva Hesse has always brought it home to me. This is a photograph on the left of the great synagogue of Hamburg in Borna Platz, where I think William Hesse actually went. And on the left, standing, and on the right, destroyed by the Nazis. So it's a pretty facile leap, I think, to interpret a piece of Rope Peace, this very last work of Eva Hesse, as a recall of a past like this. This is not true. But that past, she had a sense of it, had been reduced to ruins. And there is no doubt that she has made a kind of an amazing achievement, I think, in Rope Peace, because it's at the same time very wondrous, very chaotic, and it is also a contradiction because it is completely just a bunch of old ropes hanging from the ceiling, very derelict, a kind of destroyed piece too. But to go back to the whole curatorial sense of making this piece, we have to realize that Rope Peace was purposefully constructed dereliction. To repeat, Bill Barrett, who has written a lot about making the work, made the piece with Eva Hesse, the second part of it, in March, just before she died. And then he tells us the ropes were knotted and they were tangled, they were joined with wires, they were dipped, and the wires were hung from hooks in the ceiling. It was very, very structured. Hesse chose to describe in January the piece for Life magazine. And she said that she knew it was a structure of chaos. And it really kind of repeats what Lepard had been saying about Laocoon, that both chaos and structure could be embedded in the same piece, that she had worked on it in Laocoon, and she was back at it with Rope Peace. This piece is very ordered, she said. She's quoted in Life magazine as saying this. And then this is the important part for me. Maybe, Hesse says, maybe I'll make it more structured. Maybe I'll leave it changeable. Changeable is Hesse's own adjective, the possibility she considers for the work. She continues, when it is completed, its order could be chaos. That we know from Jackson Pollock. Hesse has said that her Rope Piece could be changeable, unbounded, like a real thing in time and space, and it could be almost nothing, almost non-art, changeable. As a curator, again, I want now to return to the physical Rope Piece that I've had to deal with in my life at the Whitney. Next slide. I'll just show you a few pictures from the afterlife, however, before I get there. And this is a piece still in the Bowery studio, and this is a piece with the person who she worked with, Doug Johns, mostly on the fiberglass pieces. This was made, I think, during her lifetime, but I'm not sure. Next slide. This is the piece as it was moved out of the Bowery loft and into the loft of Donald Droll, the dealer, and it was arranged by Donald Droll. He did not know how to do it. This is how he arranged it, and it was sold to Victor Gans from its hanging this way. Next slide. This is the piece as it appeared in 1972 at the Guggenheim Museum. It looks different, and I think from what Bill Barrett told me that it was hung by Sol LeWitt with Donald Droll. Next slide. And this is how I have to deal with it. If Hesse meant it to remain, in her words, changeable, what has happened 55 years later? Has it remained so? Is its shape static now? Is it fixed? She died before the piece was exhibited, so nobody knows. When Solowit hung it shortly after her death for the Guggenheim, and he hung it undocumented, it took him days to figure out how to hang it. It looked okay from one side, and it wasn't right from the other. But I think, honestly, no one knows exactly what the right way was. It's been a matter of interpretation always. Should it be opened up to look like a spider's web, or should it be squashed, compressed to look like a hornet's nest? And I think this is intentional. Bill Barrett installed the piece 12 times for Victor Gans, who bought it. And he said he came to the conclusion that there was no right way to install the work. The ropes are flexible, and they can be expanded and contracted in an infinite variety of ways. The infinity and structure of the tangle remains forever unchangeable. Barrett now feels the work is probably unfinished, but that one of the qualities Hesse meant it to have was change, that it would shift shape to fit the conditions where it was to be hung. However, the work has aged. It's now 55 years later, and we've been less able to do this. The ropes have lost their flexibility, and the latex is brittle that it was dipped in. Although it was originally the latex was flexible and soft around the ropes, now the latex is brittle and the ropes inside are more flexible than their covering. So what you see here is how the Whitney now has decided to deal with it. In order to stir it up as little as possible, it is always kept hanging like this. It's never put, as I saw it originally, back into a drawer. It's always hung in open boxes like this, and it's hung from the same 11 or 13 wires that hang it when it's hung in place. The condition of its maintenance preserves the ghost of that splendid condition, almost a dance of its making. The will of the materials that Hesse trusted to give the piece its shapelessness originally have now had their way, and they are making it less flexible. It's almost as if they were willing to go so far, but no further. And so this thing really has to be kept pretty rigidly according to one diagram. Every time I see rope piece hanging in a well-lighted white space, which is the way you see it in the few museums that get to show it, I feel that in becoming an icon, the work has lost some of its power, even though the museum has made very elaborate plans to, next slide, and I think this is the last slide, to always hang it very carefully, store it very carefully, maintain its tangled uncertainty and all its grandeur. It is nonetheless like an altarpiece ripped out of a church and reinstalled in a museum. Or maybe it's closer to a performance that was admired at one time in real time and known thereafter through photographs. The whole impact of the rope piece, the making of it, the planning of it, I feel can never be recovered. Thank you.